This is lesson 11 of the counseling module, and barring any unusual circumstances or things that people need further clarification upon, it's the last video in this module. In this particular video, we're going to explore something called the stages of change. And I happen to have put it into the module about counseling, but you might see how it fits into others of our modules as well, including the planning module we recently finished. It isn't only about counseling. A couple of other things that you might need to know about this before I get started. Stages of change is kind of the simple, I think much more understandable name of this. There's another name, and that is the Transtheoretical Model. And so if you hear people talk about Transtheoretical Model or TTM, they're just trying to impress you by using a fancy word for this thing I'm about to describe, this 5-stage process. You might also hear another term called harm reduction. And harm reduction is connected to this idea, and so is the idea that you might hear of low barrier programs. So I'll try to bring those into the equation or conversation as we go along here. But that's a quick glossary for you of some of the words we'll use. Now I'm going to start not by going through the slide, but by telling you a story, a true story. And so you can sit back for just a moment and listen to this story, because I'll reflect on the story as I go through the 2 slides that are in this video. So this story comes from a real person, and this person was in our classroom a few years ago when a prior class did a student-led seminar. And amongst the people they had come and do some speaking was a person who had lived experience with drug and alcohol abuse and addiction and recovery. And they told this story, and I'll let you see how it ends at the end of it. But this story just perfectly exemplifies what we mean by the stages of change. And we'll give this lady a name. It's not a real name. We'll call her Jessica. So Jessica was a lady who lived on the downtown east side, and she had an addiction to a very serious drug of choice. I won't say which one, but it's a one that had a very significant impact on every aspect of her life. It was causing her significant impacts on her physical health. It was causing her to be engaged in criminal activity in order to support her habit. That included prostitution and theft. It created a requirement for her to be around people that were not necessarily safe because they were either distributing drugs or who were people that were abusive men in her life, but they were sources of income and sharing of drugs. She was isolated from her family of origin. She was not proud of herself. She was unemployed and poor, and she was in trouble with the law. So she was really in a very bad place. But perhaps the most disturbing thing about Jessica was that she had lived this way for such a long time that it was normal for her. And in fact, she was used to kind of walking what she described as sort of a regular beat around the downtown east side. And she said that as she was walking around this beat, she started to notice this one particular door that she would go past all the time. And in particular, she noticed it during the summertime when it was open a little bit, and she kind of could see some people inside that, in her words, she could kind of see were like her, was how she put it. And she was very, very minimally curious about this place at first, but she walked past it so often that it caused her to think about it. And then one day, just after walking past it for a few weeks, she poked her head into the door and took a closer look. And she noticed that the people that were in this room were similar to her. They were of the same ethnicity, they were all women, they were relatively similar in her age. And she could tell by looking at them that they were people from the same socioeconomic class, and she could guess that they were people who had some of the challenges in their lives, including drug and alcohol addiction, that she had had. Now, I don't remember if she did it the very first day or if she poked her head in a couple more times before she finally got up the nerve to ask somebody, but she spoke to one of these ladies and she simply said, "What do you do here?" And the lady said, "Oh, we play cards." "What do you mean you play cards?" Well, she said, "Well, this lady said, we come in every day and we just sit and drink coffee and we play cards and we talk with each other. And it's free. You should join us sometime." So I said earlier that I would explain the term low barrier. Well, this is a classic example of low barrier. It's literally got no locks on the door. There's no staff that make you sign in. It's free. It's got food. Nobody is making you have a dress code. It's very, very, very easy for a person to come in. And it's situated literally in the neighborhood where the most needy people are going to find it. So anyways, Jessica, I don't remember if she said yes to sitting down and playing cards the very first day, but it didn't take her long before she finally agreed to sit down and play cards. And she sat down and played cards with really no agenda. She wasn't there to do anything other than to pass the time and maybe to get a free cup of coffee and to make some connections. And so she played cards until after a few times of doing this, it became a new routine for her. And she started to notice, and this is very common in some facilities like clubhouses and friendship centers and so forth. She started to notice that around this very large gathering space where everybody would sit and play cards and have coffee and cookies, that there were all these doors on the outside of this space. And she turned to one of the ladies at the table, or the ladies in general, and said, "What goes on in those rooms?" And they said, "Well, in this room over here is a person who helps you find a job. This person helps you get ID. This person's a drug and alcohol counselor. This person helps you to find housing. This person helps you with your health," and so forth. And Jessica said, "Oh, how very interesting," and continued to deal the cards. She got so comfortable coming there and dropping in and playing cards and talking with her friends that she just said, get up and go get herself a cup of coffee whenever she wanted to. And so she was doing that one day when a lady came out of one of those little rooms and was standing beside her filling her own styrofoam cup of coffee. And Jessica said to her, "Hey, what do you do? I noticed you coming in and out of these rooms." And the lady said, "Oh, I'm a drug and alcohol counselor," and introduced herself and had a very brief conversation to just kind of give a little bit of face time, a little bit of recognition of who was who. Not really a bigger endorsement of what she did than that, no specific overtures or invitations, just familiarity. Had a cup of coffee with this person, and Jessica went back to the table. And after a few times of sort of rubbing shoulders or bumping into this person, she began to ask questions that were a bit more pointed about what she did and how much it cost and what was involved. And it wasn't very long after those conversations started that Jessica thought, well, maybe I'll go sit down with this counselor in a group session or have a little informal conversation. From there, those initial interactions led her to coming to the point where she decided that she would sit down and have a more routine or regular conversation with this counselor and begin to think of herself as somebody actually receiving treatment. She began to accept help by being navigated or referred by this alcohol and drug counselor to other people who could help her with her clothing or help her with her housing. And at some point, Jessica came to understand and agree that she needed something more than just a sit-down counselor, that she would do well to get some detox, which helps her to get through the physiological withdrawal symptoms of getting off of a drug, as well as to go into a recovery program. And it turned out that this therapist, this alcohol and drug counselor, could help her with that. And so Jessica said, let's start getting into some very specific plans. So she filled out application forms and she picked a date and they made arrangements for transportation. And the day came to go to detox and Jessica didn't show up. And there was nobody really terribly surprised about that in the program because it turns out that's not that uncommon. But not only did Jessica not show up, of course, she felt a bit shamed, or ashamed, not that somebody else had shamed her. And she felt like she had let people down. And this is Jessica telling us this in a classroom discussion. And so she didn't show up for a few days. But luckily, she had developed enough relationships with people that she ran into people and they asked about her. And she began to feel comfortable enough to come back after just a few days away. When she got there, she kind of realized that this counselor was not angry at her, that this counselor was still there for her. And so they replanned. They challenged the idea of going again. This time, Jessica not only made the plans, but actually followed through on the plans, and she went into detox. And from detox, she was accepted into a program out here in Mission, which is how she got from the downtown east side out here. Now, the road through the program, the recovery program, was not an easy one. Lots and lots and lots of work, lots of tears, lots of moments of giving up, lots of moments of anger. And in some cases, people don't do what Jessica did. They don't stick with it. Sometimes they leave. And Jessica, in this case, did stick with it. But I don't think it was Jessica's first time at ever going through recovery. So that might explain why. It's not uncommon for people to kind of give up partway through. And sometimes it takes a little bit of work to find them a program that has a better fit. But Jessica got through it. And in fact, Jessica got through it so well and developed such great relationships and it turned out so well connected to people here in this Mission area that she was invited by the facility to play an ongoing role as a mentor. I don't think it was a paid role, but it was a mentoring role that had a title. She was asked to lead meetings and to gather together the women's group. And Jessica was very, very heartened to do this. It was a meaningful thing for her. And long after she had gotten through the process of this very intense recovery, which can be very exciting for people, she had something that kept her involved in doing all the things that were healthy for her because she was helping other people. And that is why about a year and a half or 2 years after she first went into this little door in the downtown east side, she ended up being somebody who was not only continuing to be sober and clean, but who was helping other people. And she described her life as the best she'd ever had it and beyond her expectations. So that story is a perfect example of somebody going through the 5 stages of change. So let me show you by overlaying now those 5 stages. When Jessica was in the start part of the story where she was walking around the streets and all the bad stuff was happening in her life and she didn't even think about change, or maybe she out of hand rejected the idea of change, she was what we call pre-contemplative. Pre meaning before, contemplative meaning thinking about it. She was literally not yet even thinking about it. And even if somebody had tried to force her, for example, through an incarceration or through a court-mandated program, she would not have been ready for change. And we've learned this now. We've learned that forcing people to go into programs doesn't work because, in fact, it actually has a deleterious effect. We get resistant. We therefore become entrenched in our opinions and we shut off emotionally, psychologically, and socially, and we learn not to trust the therapeutic system. And that's kind of what had happened to Jessica in the past. She'd had bad experiences, and so she was definitely in this pre-contemplative stage. She was pressured by other people, but it only made her more stubborn. It was because she became sort of the invitation to herself by walking around and seeing this and becoming curious that she started to move into the contemplative stage and started to realize by looking at people who looked like her that she was helpable and that the help was right there in front of her. That took some time as well. And it just began with a simple thing of acknowledging that there was something wrong and that there was something that might help. And those two things are very, very critical. And if you've been through 12-step programming, you know there's some of the things that happen in the earlier steps of the 12s and or of the 12 steps. And just getting people thinking about it at this point is what it's all about. So in part 1, we really want to build relationships and create opportunities for exposure to help. In part 2, we want to get people thinking about. We want to encourage discussion, encourage questioning, just have people know that they can talk to us, even if they aren't ready yet to say what. So this is part of the reason why I've emphasized that giving advice can actually create more of a barrier than just letting people explore for themselves. Even when a person does become quite contemplative, they may not know how to proceed. And here's where they may start asking for you to navigate with them, to go with them to somebody, maybe physically, or to go with them by sitting on a computer, or by giving them emotional support, such as, I will call you later on today and see how it went. Maybe it's about handing a person a pamphlet and reading it with them. Maybe it's about just talking out why a person might be afraid to go and try something. But navigation, as I've said earlier, is much better than just simply giving people information or referral. In this contemplative stage, people are often much more general about when they might get to things. They talk about doing it someday, or they say, I would like to, or I wish that, as opposed to feeling like they should give it some specific concrete plan in terms of date or steps. They might feel this curious combination of being excited and hopeful, but at the same time hesitant and having trepidation or nervousness. That latter one might surprise you, but remember, if the only person you've ever known in all your life is you, even if you're not thrilled with who you are, it's a scary thing to think about losing the parts of yourself that you have come to know. And that's a really common thing we hear from people. Also, a lot of people have been traumatized. They have had their feelings dashed on the rocks. They've tried something only to find out it didn't work. And that hurts a lot. So some people just stop taking risks because they're worried about getting hurt. So that's why we may see this strange kind of vacillation or alternating, a person talking very excitedly, and then the next time you talk to them, no, that's not for me. I could never do that. And just letting people work through that is an incredibly powerful thing. So Jessica did that by going and having lots of coffee chats by the coffee urn with this alcohol and drug person. And it was really about gradually taking the steps into that office. Everything that Jessica did, she thought of as being kind of temporary or a one-time experience. And that's a really important thing. We don't need people to commit to doing something forever. Try it one time and review it. I can't tell you how important it is. Let's try that once and then I'll find out how it is. Let's do it for 5 minutes and find out how you're feeling. And that really works for people. The third stage was preparation. Here's where Jessica started pinning down the dates and the times and the transportation to go to detox. But just like a real life scenario you might encounter, she was still very fragile. And it became really real for her when it was actually Friday morning and she needed to show up and get a ride to detox. Sometimes people get to detox and they leave before you even get back to your office or by the end of the day. And you might have to go through this process with them a couple of times. You might have to reach out to them and let them know that you still love them, that you still care about them, that you're still there for them, so that people don't feel like they have burnt their bridges. It's very, very common for people to do this. Finally, though, if you're lucky, you'll get to a point where you can actually take action. And in exactly the same way as Jessica got into detox and then from there built up momentum to go into a recovery program, once the action starts, it often starts to kind of take over for the person. However, it's not a guarantee. Again, people do quit partway through. Sometimes very disturbingly, they quit very near the end, as the idea of being forced to leave or having to go through another transition or being worried about being alone and self-reliant all can take a toll on people. So it is not uncommon for people to go through action more than one time, for us to go backwards in these stages and then try again. So don't be surprised if you have to find different alternatives for action for people or do it more than one time. This is by far the most energy consuming stage because now we're right in the work. We're having to program, we're having to adjust and do reactive things. Very, very common. You'll notice that this is the fourth stage. And think about how many times over the course of history we have created programs without thinking about how to get people in them, and how many people have been lost because we immediately try to take somebody and put them in action. That doesn't work. So you can see that action is actually quite late in this process. And then finally, number 5 was maintenance. And Jessica chose a really cool way to make sure that she was healthy through maintenance. You see, the thing about maintenance is it gets boring for people. It's not novel anymore. When we're going through all these other stages, there's excitement and we make new relationships and we might start to feel the benefits for the first time in a very long time of improved sobriety or improved mental health or improved physical health. And we're going to probably get reconnected with people, make new friends, and be told how proud we are. We'll get pins and cakes and parties and graduation ceremonies and certificates and lots of cool stuff. It's exciting to go through all of that stuff. And then one day it just becomes your new normal. And for a lot of people, they backslide. They start to lose ground and stop doing the things that are part of what makes them well. It's incredibly common, whether it's going to a 12-step meeting or taking a medicine, for people to say to themselves, how important can it be if I don't do it this one time? And soon 1 becomes 2, and then 3, and so forth. So what Jessica did was a really cool way to maintain, and that was that she became a mentor. If you're familiar with the 12-step programs, steps 11 and 12 really get people to do this, to become responsible for others. And by doing that, we get a feeling of being rewarded, we get a feeling of being accountable, and we therefore are more mindful and careful about our wellness. It's not the only way to do maintenance. Sometimes just having a schedule can be important, having a buddy system, doing a journal, having a professional that checks in on us. All of these things, or a combination of these things, can be important, because maintenance is very often neglected, and if we don't do it right, we'll go right back to where we were. It's really hard to motivate people, but we also need to understand that it's not that uncommon for people to relapse or slip or trip or fall or fail. All of these words get used. And instead, I would rather think of it this way. If a person like Jessica used a drug 2 or 3 times every day before the beginning of this story, and then 18 months later, she relapses, she has gone 18 months between the use of those, between the incidences of using a substance. 18 months. The factor of improvement there is off the chain. And if we can reach out to her and help her to understand that she was the one who did that, then we can take that 18 months and often we can extend it, sometimes forever and sometimes for many, many years. So instead of making it all about how long has that person been drug-free or stable in their mental health or effectively employed, instead think about how long do they want to stay off the horse for and become proud of the fact that they resume right away getting back into the healthy habits. So catching people and making sure that you don't create shame or blame and inviting them to come in at whatever stage of change is most effective for them, and restarting the process is a really important thing, because once you start the process, it creates momentum again. If you don't start the process, we have this very strange, very curious human characteristic of cascading in the wrong direction. When we start to mess up, we tend to keep on snowballing that, or having the snowball effect. We want to create a positive snowball effect. All right, so that'll wrap up this video. That'll wrap up this whole module. Remember, stages of change isn't only about counseling. It's really going to be valuable to you as you think about your planning module. It'll matter in just about everything you do. If people talk about the Transtheoretical Model, you'll know why. One last thing. We talked about harm reduction. Harm reduction is what was going on with Jessica in the very beginning of this story. The idea that she could go and find a safe place. Now, whether or not she was going into a safe place to use a needle or to sleep overnight in a homeless shelter, what those places had going for them that the rest of the community doesn't understand is not that they're just a safe place for people to do things that have not been working for them. They're also about two other important ingredients in that pre-contemplative stage. They're about exposure to help, and they're about relationships. And once those two things start to take root, the seeds of change will occur. So the next time you hear somebody talk about harm reduction, whether they're talking about an outreach worker or a drop-in program or a safe injection or a shelter, or people going out and doing needle pickup or doing medical clinics, these are all examples of harm reduction. But the secret behind these is what we call a gateway. When a person goes and gets that free food from Friendship Center or brings in their container of new needles to Fraser Health, what they don't realize is that they're building familiarity in the same way as we might become the regular at a coffee shop. They start to become more comfortable over time, and now the magic can happen and stories like Jessica's can become true. Okay, hopefully that is a good note for you to end on. And if you have any questions about this, like everything else, please reach out to me.